A cozy cafe in the heart of Brookhaven, New York, bustled with its usual lunchtime crowd, the faint hum of conversations blended with the soft clatter of silverware, creating a lively yet comforting ambiance. But little did anyone know, an ordinary afternoon here would soon become the backdrop for an extraordinary story. Before we dive into today's tale, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It's your support that helps me continue bringing these heartfelt narratives to life. Now, let's begin. Dr. Martin Hayes sat quietly at his desk, his hands running wearily over the neat stack of patient files. As the head of emergency medicine at Brookhaven General Hospital, he was no stranger to long hours. Today had been especially grueling, with a full 18-hour shift of non-stop cases ranging from car accidents to severe illnesses. His white coat, slightly crumpled, bore the faint traces of coffee stains, a testament to the battle between his exhaustion and determination. Just one more, he murmured to himself, signing off on a final chart with a flourish. Despite his weariness, a small smile played on his lips. Each signature, each completed case, represented another person helped, another family comforted. At last, Dr. Hayes slung his stethoscope over the back of his chair and grabbed his coat. As he stepped out of the hospital's fluorescent-lit corridors into the cool autumn sunlight, he paused to take a deep breath. The air, crisp and fragrant with hints of fallen leaves, filled his lungs. "You've earned a break, Martin," he told himself softly, his smile growing. Brookhaven's vibrant downtown stretched before him, filled with charming brick-front shops, trees lined with golden leaves, and pedestrians bustling about. Among these was his destination for a rare treat, the Copper Spoon, an upscale cafe famed for its cozy atmosphere and gourmet meals. Dr. Hayes had driven past it many times but rarely indulged. Today, however, felt like an exception. The cafe's entrance, adorned with cascading vines and warm lighting, welcomed him as he approached. A smiling hostess greeted him warmly, her name tag reading Emily. "Table for one?" she asked. "Yes, please," Dr. Hayes replied, his voice gentle but tinged with fatigue. As Emily led him to a quiet corner booth, Dr. Hayes was acutely aware of his disheveled appearance. His tie was slightly loosened, and the pocket of his coat was filled with pens and a small notepad. "I must look out of place," he thought, chuckling softly to himself. But the allure of a quiet meal and perhaps a cup of tea outweighed his self-consciousness. Seated at his table, Dr. Hayes leaned back against the cushion and allowed the cafe's tranquil atmosphere to envelop him. The soft strains of a piano melody played overhead, mingling with the muted chatter of other diners. He glanced at the crisp white menu in front of him, the elegant script promising an array of mouth-watering dishes. The waiter, a polite young man in a neatly pressed apron, approached with a bottle of sparkling water. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I start you with our wine list?" "Just water for now, thank you, Doctor," Hayes replied. "And I'll take the roasted salmon with herb butter." The waiter nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Dr. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the stillness. For someone accustomed to the relentless pace of the ER, this felt like a small luxury. But peace can be fleeting. The whispers began softly, barely audible at first. Dr. Hayes noticed them as he sipped his water, his ears catching fragments of murmurs from nearby tables. A couple glanced in his direction, their conversation abruptly halting when he met their gaze. Another diner, an older gentleman in a tailored suit, openly stared. It dawned on Dr. Hayes that his hospital scrubs, paired with his slightly wrinkled coat, might have drawn their attention. This was a place of polished exteriors and formal attire. To them, he likely seemed like an oddity. Dr. Hayes shook off the discomfort, focusing instead on the warmth of the cafe and the anticipation of a good meal. But the sense of being watched lingered, prickling at the edges of his composure. When the waiter returned with his dish, he hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing the plate down. "Sir," the waiter began, his tone awkward, "would you prefer to see our bar menu? It's a bit more casual." Dr. Hayes blinked, surprised by the suggestion. But he responded with patience. "No, thank you. This is perfect." The waiter's ears reddened as he nodded and retreated. Dr. Hayes sighed, attempting to enjoy his meal despite the subtle undercurrent of tension. Unbeknownst to him, the cafe manager, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze, had taken notice. From behind the counter, the manager whispered to one of his staff, his tone laced with suspicion. "Who's the man at table 3? He asked, nodding discreetly towards Dr. Hayes. "Doesn't he seem out of place?" The hostess, Emily, glanced at Dr. Hayes from her station. Her expression was thoughtful but neutral as she replied to the manager. "That's table 3. He said his name was Dr. Hayes when he came in. He's polite, tipped me for seating him, and ordered from the main menu," she said. "Is something wrong?" The manager frowned, his brow furrowed with skepticism. "I'm not sure. He's wearing scrubs, but anyone could get those online. And handing over a credit card right after ordering? Feels off to me." His voice dropped lower, laden with suspicion. "Let's keep an eye on him." Emily hesitated, sensing the implications of his words, but ultimately nodded. The manager stepped away, retreating into his office, where he picked up the phone. Dr. Hayes was midway through his meal, the roasted salmon exactly the treat he'd hoped for, when 2 police officers entered the cafe. Their uniforms immediately drew the attention of the diners, and the previously subdued ambiance became charged with curiosity. Heads turned, whispers swirled, and even the kitchen staff peeked out from behind the swinging doors. The officers, one tall and broad-shouldered with a no-nonsense expression, and the other shorter and younger, surveyed the room. The manager approached them briskly, gesturing discreetly toward Dr. Hayes. "That's him," the manager whispered. "Table 3. He used a credit card. Something about him doesn't sit right." The officers exchanged a glance before making their way to Dr. Hayes's table. He noticed their approach just as he was taking a sip of water. Setting the glass down, he met their gaze with quiet curiosity. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his voice calm. The taller officer, whose badge identified him as Officer Blake, nodded. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions. May we see some identification?" Dr. Hayes blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Of course," he replied, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his wallet. "I'm Dr. Martin Hayes. I work at Brookhaven General Hospital." He handed over his hospital ID, his driver's license, and his credit card. The officers examined them closely, their expressions neutral but their body language tense. The surrounding diners watched the interaction intently, some openly gawking while others whispered behind their hands. Officer Blake's partner, Officer Ruiz, stepped aside to radio the station, verifying Dr. Hayes's credentials. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as the cafe remained eerily quiet, save for the murmurs of diners speculating about what was unfolding. Dr. Hayes sat upright, his posture calm but his mind racing. He was no stranger to the weight of judgment. As a black man, he had encountered moments like this before, moments where his competence, his identity, or even his presence in certain spaces were called into question. But this was different. This was happening in public, in front of dozens of strangers. Emily, watching from the hostess stand, shifted uncomfortably. She bit her lip, her instincts telling her something was wrong with the way this was unfolding. The man she had seated didn't strike her as someone who would cause trouble. In fact, he seemed kind, polite, even humble. Unable to stay silent, she approached the officers cautiously. "Excuse me," she began softly, drawing their attention. "Is there something wrong?" Dr. Hayes seemed perfectly fine when he arrived. Officer Blake gave her a curt nod, but didn't elaborate. "Just following up on a report," he said. "A report about what?" Emily pressed. Her tone was firm, though not confrontational. "He's eating lunch. Why are you interrogating him?" Officer Ruiz glanced at her before looking back at Dr. Hayes, whose composed demeanor only made the officers feel more uneasy. "We've received a report of potential credit card fraud." Ruiz replied, his voice clipped. Dr. Hayes's eyes widened slightly, a spark of indignation flaring in his chest, though he kept his tone measured. Credit card fraud? Officers, I handed my card over willingly and it has my name on it. Is this standard protocol? The manager emerged from his office, his face set in a mask of authority. I called them, he announced, drawing the attention of the room. We have a reputation to uphold here, and I wasn't about to take chances. Dr. Hayes felt the weight of the diner's stares intensify. His gaze shifted between the manager and the officers, his calm beginning to waver under the pressure of humiliation. Taking a deep breath, he addressed the officers again. I understand you have a job to do, he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. But I'm telling you, I have done nothing wrong. If you'd like to contact my hospital to confirm my identity, I'll even give you the phone number. Officer Ruiz hesitated, his hand hovering over the radio. He glanced at Officer Blake, who nodded curtly. We'll need to verify that, Ruiz said. The restaurant fell into an awkward silence, broken only by the clinking of plates as some diners attempted to distract themselves with their meals. Others leaned closer, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. An older woman seated a few tables away turned to her husband, her voice carrying across the room. This doesn't feel right, George. Look at him, he's being treated like a criminal for eating his lunch. Her husband nodded grimly but said nothing. Another diner, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and a kind expression, stood up from her table and addressed the room. This man has shown nothing but dignity while being questioned like this, she said, her voice firm. Maybe we should all take a moment to think about why we're letting this happen. Her words hung in the air, creating a palpable shift in the room's energy. Some diners murmured in agreement, while others exchanged guilty glances. Officer Ruiz stepped aside to place a call to Brookhaven General Hospital, leaving Officer Blake standing with Dr. Hayes. The tension between them was palpable. Dr. Hayes clasped his hands on the table, his steady gaze meeting Officer Blake's. Officer, Dr. Hayes began, his tone calm but resolute. I've been a doctor for over 15 years. I've treated patients from every background in every kind of emergency. I came here today for a simple meal after a long shift. What exactly makes you think I don't belong here? Officer Blake shifted uncomfortably. He was trained to maintain his composure, but the quiet strength in Dr. Hayes's words made him falter. Before he could respond, Officer Ruiz returned, his expression slightly softened. It checks out, Ruiz said, holding up his radio. The hospital confirmed Dr. Hayes is who he says he is. He's the head of emergency medicine. The room, which had been suspended in a state of hushed anticipation, suddenly seemed to exhale. The diners began murmuring among themselves, their voices tinged with relief, regret, or lingering curiosity. The manager approached the officers, his brow furrowed. So, everything's fine then? He asked, his voice edged with defensiveness. Officer Ruiz nodded. Yes, there's no issue here. He turned to Dr. Hayes. We apologize for the inconvenience, Dr. Hayes. Dr. Hayes tilted his head slightly, the weight of their words failing to erase the humiliation he felt. An inconvenience? He repeated, his voice measured but sharp. Being accused of fraud, interrogated in front of a room full of strangers and having to prove my identity, that's not an inconvenience, officer. It's an insult. Ruiz's shoulders sagged slightly. You're right, sir. It shouldn't have happened. We were acting on a report, but we could have handled this differently. The manager, however, didn't seem to share their remorse. Well, you can't blame us for being cautious, he said, crossing his arms. We have a reputation to protect. Dr. Hayes turned his attention to the manager, his eyes steady and unwavering. A reputation for what exactly? For assuming that a man in scrubs can't afford a meal here? Or that he doesn't belong because he doesn't fit your idea of what a doctor should look like? The manager faltered, his posture stiffening as whispers rippled through the restaurant. Emily, the hostess, stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. Doctor, Hayes has been nothing but polite since he walked in. This whole thing feels wrong, and I think you owe him an apology. The manager flushed, but before he could respond, a voice from the crowd spoke up. "She's right," said the older woman who had spoken earlier. She rose from her seat, her expression resolute. "This man deserves better. We all deserve better than to see someone treated like this." The atmosphere shifted further, with more diners nodding in agreement. The manager's bravado began to crumble under the weight of the crowd's disapproval. He turned to Dr. Hayes, his face pale. I'm sorry if I overreacted," he stammered. "It wasn't personal." Dr. Hayes exhaled slowly, his frustration evident. "It may not have felt personal to you," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "But it was to me. You don't understand how exhausting it is to prove, again and again, that you deserve to be here, to be seen as equal, to be respected." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the manager nodded stiffly. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was wrong." As the officers left, the room slowly returned to its earlier hum of activity, though the energy was far from normal. Emily approached Dr. Hayes's table, her expression earnest. "Dr. Hayes," she said softly, "I'm so sorry for everything that happened. I don't know what I could have done to stop it, but I should have tried." Dr. Hayes gave her a small, weary smile. "Thank you, Emily. You spoke up, and that takes courage." He gestured to his now cold meal. "I think I've lost my appetite, though. Could you pack this up for me?" "Of course," she said, quickly taking the plate to the back. As Dr. Hayes waited, the older woman who had defended him earlier approached his table. "Dr. Hayes," she began, her voice warm but tinged with sadness. "I'm sorry you were treated this way. It wasn't right. If there's anything I can do, please let me know." Dr. Hayes looked up at her, his expression softening. "You already did," he said. "You spoke up when it mattered." The woman smiled faintly and nodded before returning to her seat. With his meal packed and the bill settled, Dr. Hayes left the cafe, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air. The autumn sunlight warmed his face, but the weight of the incident lingered heavily on his shoulders. As he walked, his mind churned with emotions, anger, sadness, and a deep resolve. "This can't be how it ends," he thought. "This can't be just another story of injustice." By the time he reached his car, an idea had begun to form in his mind. An idea to turn this painful experience into something meaningful, not just for himself, but for the community he served. That evening, Dr. Hayes sat quietly in his small apartment, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The soft hum of the clock on the wall was the only sound breaking the silence. But in his mind, the events of the day played over and over. Whispers in the cafe, the curious eyes of strangers, the police officers questioning him, and the uncomfortable confrontation with the manager. Yet, beneath the frustration and exhaustion, a spark of something else flickered. A seed of an idea that had begun to form the moment he had walked out of the restaurant. He knew that what had happened to him couldn't just be a fleeting moment of injustice. He wasn't going to let it be. He needed to do something with this. As he sat there, sipping his tea, he thought about how he could turn this painful experience into something bigger. He had spent years treating patients in the ER, saving lives, comforting families in distress. But he had never felt like his work reached far beyond those hospital walls. Perhaps this was the chance he had been waiting for. The next morning, as the sun broke through the blinds, Dr. Hayes made a decision. He would bring together the very community that had witnessed his humiliation, his colleagues, the restaurant staff, even the police officers involved, to start a conversation about bias, prejudice, and understanding. He would organize an event, one that would not only address these issues but also offer something meaningful to the community. Dr. Hayes called his friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned physician with whom he had worked for years. He explained his idea of creating an event that would help bridge the gap between different groups within Brookhaven, something to start a dialogue, to help people better understand one another. "I'm thinking about a community health clinic," Dr. Hayes explained. Something where we offer free medical services to the community, checkups, screenings, whatever we can. But more than just a clinic, we need to make it about inclusion, about understanding each other. It's time to use this experience for something that really makes a difference. Sarah paused on the other end of the line, and then spoke, her voice filled with admiration. You're not just going to let this go, are you? No, Dr. Hayes said, his voice firm but filled with quiet determination. I'm not. I think we can turn this into something that has a real impact. This needs to be about more than just me. Over the next few days, Dr. Hayes began reaching out to people who could help him turn this idea into reality. He contacted local hospitals, asking for donations of medical supplies and volunteers. He spoke to business owners around Brookhaven, explaining his vision and asking if they would be willing to partner with him to make this event a success. One of the first to respond was Mr. Thompson, the owner of the restaurant where the incident had occurred. Dr. Hayes had been hesitant at first. He wasn't sure how the restaurant's management would respond, but to his surprise, Mr. Thompson agreed without hesitation. I owe you an apology, Dr. Hayes, Mr. Thompson had said when Dr. Hayes explained the concept. What happened that day was wrong, and I want to make it right. Let's turn this place into a space where the community can come together. The day of the event arrived, and the space that had once been the site of such tension was now alive with purpose. The restaurant had been transformed into a makeshift clinic. Volunteers from the community, including nurses and medical students, were stationed at various tables offering free health screenings, flu shots, and general advice. The air was filled with the sound of compassionate conversations, the tapping of keyboards as patients' details were recorded, and the hum of people working together for a common cause. Dr. Hayes moved through the clinic with ease, greeting familiar faces and making new connections. His heart swelled as he saw the outpouring of support from the community. The event was a success, but more importantly, it had already started to shift something within Brookhaven. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Hayes noticed Officer Blake and Officer Ruiz standing near the entrance, looking somewhat out of place in their uniforms, but trying to blend into the bustling environment. They had come to volunteer, as they had promised to help with crowd control and support in any way they could. Dr. Hayes walked over to them, offering a calm smile. Thank you for coming, he said. I appreciate it. Officer Ruiz gave a small nod. We wanted to make sure we showed up to support this, he said. We're sorry again for how everything went down. Officer Blake looked at Dr. Hayes, his expression more thoughtful than it had been during their earlier interaction. We didn't realize what we were doing until after the fact, he admitted. It wasn't just about following protocol, it was about judgment, and we're sorry for that. Dr. Hayes gave them both a steady look. I appreciate your apology, and I hope this is a learning experience for everyone, including me. The clinic continued throughout the afternoon, but as the event began to wind down, Dr. Hayes felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The restaurant, which had once been a place of division, had now become a symbol of unity, compassion, and change. People who had never spoken to one another before were sharing stories, offering support, and learning from each other. As he walked around the clinic, offering last-minute advice to patients, Dr. Hayes couldn't help but feel proud of what had been accomplished. What had started as a painful moment of humiliation had turned into a catalyst for change, something bigger than himself. Later that evening, after the event had ended and the space was being cleared out, Dr. Hayes sat down with Sarah in a quiet corner of the restaurant. I didn't expect all this, Dr. Hayes said, gesturing around at the volunteers and organizers, most of whom were still cleaning up. But this is just the beginning. We've made a difference today, but there's more to do. Sarah smiled at him, her eyes filled with pride. You turned a tough situation into something truly special, Elijah. I'm so proud of you. Dr. Hayes looked around at the people in the restaurant, at the officers who had apologized, the volunteers who had given their time, and the community members who had come together to support one another. This is just the beginning, he said, his voice filled with determination. This is just the start of the change we can make. In the days following the event, word of the community health clinic began to spread beyond Brookhaven. Local newspapers published glowing articles, featuring photos of the bustling clinic and heartfelt testimonials from attendees. The story of Dr. Hayes' transformation of a painful moment into a positive community movement caught the attention of nearby towns and even regional media outlets. At the hospital, Dr. Hayes was met with warm smiles and congratulatory handshakes from his colleagues. Nurses and doctors stopped him in the hallways to express their admiration. "Martin," Sarah said one afternoon as they grabbed a quick coffee in the break room, "I think you've started something that's going to ripple far beyond this town. People are listening and they're learning." Dr. Hayes nodded, though his mind was already racing with ideas. The success of the clinic had opened his eyes to the potential for greater change. It wasn't just about healthcare. It was about fostering understanding, breaking down prejudices, and building bridges. Meanwhile, at the Brookhaven Police Department, Officer Blake and Officer Ruiz found themselves reflecting deeply on their actions. The experience at the clinic had been eye-opening, particularly as they watched Dr. Hayes work with such kindness and grace. During a departmental meeting, Chief Sandra Lang addressed the issue head-on. "What happened with Dr. Hayes was unacceptable," she said, her tone firm. "It reflects a larger issue that we must address. Effective immediately, we will be implementing comprehensive bias training for every officer on this force." The room buzzed with murmurs as officers exchanged glances. Some were receptive, others skeptical, but Chief Lang was resolute. She introduced a local diversity and inclusion expert who would be leading the sessions, emphasizing the importance of self-reflection and understanding. Over the following weeks, the training sessions challenged the officers to confront their biases. They participated in role-playing exercises, engaged in difficult conversations, and heard testimonials from community members who had experienced discrimination. For many, it was uncomfortable but necessary work. Officer Blake, in particular, found himself grappling with the events at the cafe. During one session, he spoke candidly. "I didn't see it at the time," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But I judged Dr. Hayes based on nothing but assumptions. I thought I was just doing my job, but I realize now that I let my biases get in the way. That's not who I want to be." His words resonated with his colleagues, sparking deeper conversations and a collective commitment to do better. Dr. Hayes, meanwhile, was busy planning the next steps for the community health initiative. He partnered with Mr. Thompson and other local business owners to establish a series of ongoing events, each aimed at addressing both physical and social well-being. The restaurant became the central hub for these efforts, hosting not only health clinics, but also workshops on diversity, community dinners, and forums for open dialogue. One evening, Dr. Hayes received an email from a school principal in a neighboring town. She had read about his efforts and invited him to speak to her students about his experiences and the importance of empathy and inclusion. Dr. Hayes agreed, and the visit turned out to be one of the most rewarding moments of his journey. Standing in front of a room of attentive middle schoolers, he shared his story, not as a lecture, but as a conversation. "I want you to remember this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Everyone you meet has a story, just like you. Don't judge them based on what you see on the surface. Take the time to listen, to understand. That's how we make the world better. Together." As months turned into a year, the changes in Brookhaven were undeniable. The police department's new training programs became a model for other towns. The restaurant's transformation into a welcoming space for all earned it praise from the community and beyond. And Dr. Hayes' health initiative grew into a regional effort, with clinics popping up in neighboring areas, each inspired by his vision. On the anniversary of the first clinic, a large celebration was held at the restaurant. The space was packed with people, patients, volunteers, police officers, business owners, and families, each a testament to the power of resilience and collective action. Mr. Thompson stood on a small stage, addressing the crowd. "A year ago, this restaurant was the site of a terrible mistake," he began, his voice thick with emotion. But because of Dr. Hayes's grace and determination, it's become a place of healing, of hope, and of change. I am proud to stand here today and call him a friend. The room erupted into applause as Dr. Hayes was invited to speak. He stepped forward, his heart full as he looked out at the sea of faces. "This isn't about me," he began, his voice steady. "It's about all of us. It's about what we can achieve when we come together, when we listen to one another, and when we choose kindness over judgment." As he finished, the applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that seemed to echo far beyond the walls of the restaurant. Later that night, as Dr. Hayes walked home under a sky full of stars, he felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, but it had led to something far greater than he ever imagined. From a moment of pain had come a movement of change, a testament to the power of compassion, community, and the unyielding belief that even in the darkest moments, light can be found. Would you have responded the way Dr. Hayes did, choosing to turn pain into purpose? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's your support that allows me to share these inspiring stories with you. Thank you for watching, and until next time.